Hey guys, so before we get started today, I did want to take a second to talk about our sponsor. So our sponsor today is...
You already did this bit.
I have? What is up guys? So today we are back talking about the Nightmare Cup. So it's been a small bit of a hiatus. Only 2 days though that we've skipped out on a couple of deep dives for the Nightmare Cup. Hopefully you guys have gotten some type of value out of the regional videos. Of course there is one actually going up today. If I'm not mistaken, I'm just going to put this one out first and then have that one come out in a couple of hours. But basically, hopefully you guys have gotten some value out of that. It seems to be that the second video, a lot of people didn't much care for. Maybe it's because the video is too long. Maybe it's because it's just a lot of information. Maybe it's because I treated it too much like a classroom. That was a comment. I don't know. If you didn't like the video, I'd actually really like to know why so that I can, you know, change that for the future. Anyway, so today we're actually continuing with our Nightmare Cup, going over Alolan Raichu, which Alolan Raichu has been getting a lot of hype, and I kind of wanted to figure out why, and of course you guys did too, being that this Pokemon was highly voted for down in the comments. Of course, always remember that if you have deep dives that you're looking forward to, you can put them down in the comment section. We'll get to them as soon as I possibly can, based on how popular of a vote it is. Alolan Raichu is a psychic and electric type Pokemon, a very interesting typing to say the least. At level 40 with 15s across the board, you can max out at 2286, so not too shabby there. Now you can actually get a 1 on attack, 15 defense, and 15 stamina with a level 24.5, can actually yield you that 1496, which is not too bad as well. Now according to my spreadsheets and all the numbers that I have ran, Alolan Raichu should be 42nd in bulk and 41st in stat product. So, meh. Not too high, not too low, kind of middle of the road there. When we talk about base stats though, you can kind of see why it ends up ranking like that. Our attack stat is just so large at 201, our defense at 154 and stamina at 155. Being that the attack stat is so much higher, we end up having some issues with our CP formula, running our numbers pretty high, which kind of doesn't make us an ideal stat spread for PvP in itself. Now going over our moves here, there are a couple of moves that just make more sense than others to run, and actually it's probably not the ones that you would first expect when you first start looking at Alolan Raichu. So Volt Switch and Spark are our two fast moves. Volt Switch here gaining 2 energy per turn for 2.4 damage per turn at a whopping 2.88 damage per turn after you factor in stab. Spark here is gaining 4 energy per turn for a measly 2 damage per turn, which does bump up to 2.4 after your stab. So Spark just makes a whole lot more sense here. We get tons more energy gain, but we do sacrifice just a tiny bit of our damage. It's definitely worth it because the big point of our Alolan Raichu is to get to these charge moves as quickly as possible. Our first charge move here is actually Psychic, costing 70 for 100 damage and a 1.43 damage per energy ratio. Of course, after you factor in stab here, it does go up to 120 on the damage for a 1.71 damage per energy ratio. Thunder Punch here costing 40 for 55 damage at a 1.38 damage per energy ratio. After you factor in stab though, it does go up to 66 damage and it boosts it to a 1.65 damage per energy ratio. Our last move here is actually Wild Charge with 50 energy to fire, 90 damage at a 1.8, but after you factor in stab, it does go up to a 108 on the damage for a 2.16 damage per energy ratio. Woo, that's pretty bad. So, bad as in good. So, when we talk about these moves, Spark is really important here because it does allow us to get to these charge moves super quick. And while Psychic does have some uses in certain matchups, it's generally just kind of better to just go with Thunder Punch and Wild Charge here. Considering that the cost for the second charge move on Alolan Raichu is already extremely low, it doesn't really hurt you to have both of these moves, because while Thunder Punch does cost less, it is more of a shield buster, but Wild Charge is just right behind it, and it has such a huge payoff here. It's so much more worth it. If you had to, just absolutely had to choose between one or the two, I would probably go with Wild Charge just because of the huge payoff here, but it does have some merit that if you want to go with Thunder Punch, you can get to it in only 10 turns, which would be only 5 seconds, and you could actually be firing off an electric type move that freaking quickly. Now let's actually move on to some shield situations here. So in our first scenario, our 0 versus 0, or the kind of like closing situation, if you will, we actually end up winning 62.7% of those matchups. Not too shabby. On our next scenario is actually a 2 versus 0, which is a 92.5% win ratio, which is actually not what I'm worried about. I'm actually more worried about the Pokemon that we're gonna lose against, because if we have 2 shields in this scenario and they don't have any, I'm really interested to see which Pokemon can just flat out beat us whenever we don't have any shields. And to no one's surprise, being that we are a Psychic type, the Dark types do end up giving us a pretty big run for our money here. So of course, being that we have 2 shields, we are able to actually shield a couple of the more prominent charge moves. But whenever it gets down to the nitty gritty, Skuntank, Drapion, Nuzleaf, Shiftry, and Alolan Raticate all end up doing really well up against us. Our next scenario is actually a 0 versus 2 shield situation, which we actually only win 1.5% of those matchups. And that only matchup is actually Wobbuffet. So what that actually means is that Wobbuffet is the only Pokemon who just cannot flat out end up beating us whenever we talk about having 2 shields for him. Whenever we don't have any shields, we're still able to output enough damage to just flat out beat Wobbuffet no matter what. Unfortunately, since that's the only one that we actually end up beating, that's kind of underwhelming. So our next scenario is actually the 2 versus 2 shield situation, or in the mock-up like opening type situation. We actually do end up winning 40.3% of those matchups there, which, what does that actually tell you? Well, when you compare the 2 versus 2 and the 0 versus 0, you actually end up looking like you want to prefer to close more often than you do want to open. Being that statistically we do actually end up winning more of those matchups in that scenario. So now let's actually switch over to talk about a couple of matches with our Alolan Raichu here. So in all of the deep dives, I do take our subject Pokemon, Alolan Raichu today, and I end up putting them up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon in the cup, just to kind of see how they do. Now, you do have to remember that anything on this board is in a 1v1 shield scenario to kind of give the most evenness to both Pokemon. So, in these matchups, it kinda looks pretty good. So, Wobbuffet, Claydol, Metang, Slowbro, Slowking, and Grumpig are all pretty much sealed deals for us. They are pretty good matchups for us, and we don't really have too much of a problem. Now, as far as our losses, we do lose against Umbreon, Alolan Raticate, and we actually have a tie up against Hypno. And then we have this lonely Bronzong down here. So Bronzong was kind of in an interesting spot, because whenever you run the simulation on pvpoke.com, it does actually prefer to use Feint Attack up against our Psychic typing here. Which does make a lot of sense, but it's generally not the preferred moveset that a lot of people have, so I did want to try to run it both ways. Here's the interesting part. With Feint Attack, it has no problem taking out our Alolan Raticate. But if you factor in it using Confusion instead, which is the more preferred fast move here, you can actually end up beating Bronzong. So that ends up making it kind of a toss-up. I would say in general you shouldn't have to worry about Bronzong. But just in case someone out there is trying to get cheeky with you, they can end up beating it if they have the Feint Attack. Now let's actually talk a little bit about our counters here. So this section is kind of meant to be for what should we actually be focusing our attention on versus what should we actually bring to the table to actually combat the subject Pokemon. So in terms of what we should focus our efforts on with Alolan Raichu here, we actually have the Psychic typing. So being that we are Psychic ourselves does actually help a lot with a lot of the resistance to this damage that's going to be coming in from the Psychic types. So being that that's true and that we have neutral moves, we end up having the favorable setup from the get-go. But there are a couple of Pokemon, there are 4 losses that we still end up having inside the Psychic typing. Claydol. Well, that one's kind of understandable. Claydol, actually being a ground type Pokemon, ends up resisting a ton of our damage, plus it ends up having Earthquake, which is super effective up against us, so it has a really good time beating us there. Execute and Executor also fall in this list. So those also are going to have some type of resistance to us, plus they're actually going to be able to just output a ton of neutral damage to us with grass type moves, so they end up winning that one. And then Bronzong, you know, we're going to put our quotes around Bronzong here. He could beat us, but like we talked about earlier, it's probably not going to be too much of an issue, but it could actually be an issue if they are running Feint Attack. Then we actually have 3 ties before we start winning. So Alolan Raichu, you know, we would tie up against ourselves with this exact same moveset. Hypno, which we did talk about a little bit earlier, and Gallade actually end up being all 3 of the ties there. So once we get past those though, any other psychic types are no big deal for us. That ends up working out a lot in our favor, considering that we win the majority of those matchups. Next, we actually have the fighting types. So the fighting types actually end up being not too big of a problem here. We actually only tie up against 4 of them. So Toxicroak, Toxicroak does have access to Mud Bomb, plus it has access to Poison Jab, which is going to be neutral to us, right? Then we actually have Hitmonchan. So Hitmonchan actually has a couple of unique moves that allow it to not die super fast. So it does have Power Up Punch, and then it can actually utilize most of the elemental punches are going to be neutral to us, so we don't have to really like worry about super effective damage, but that neutral damage is really important in itself. So we basically end up tying after the Hitmonchan actually gets off 2 power-up punches. It actually has enough to end up tying up against us. Gallade, of course, makes another appearance, being that he's also Psychic type. We've already talked a little bit about him. Breloom actually shows up in this list of ties because Breloom actually ends up resisting a ton of our damage, being that he does carry that grass typing, and he can actually output a ton of neutral damage if he decides to use grass moves rather than his fighting moves. And then let's actually switch over to what should we actually bring to the table to flat out beat our Alolan Raichu here. And of course, no surprise, the dark types. We actually only end up winning up against 4 of these. So Alolan Muck, we actually can take that matchup. Crawdaunt, which makes a lot of sense because of the water typing. Houndoom, interesting, but okay. And Honchkrow. So Honchkrow does carry that flying typing, which makes it an issue. We do actually end up tying up against both Sneasel and Spiritomb, so both of those are kind of interesting to watch out for. But after that, we just really start to lose up against all of these. Funny enough though, Alolan Raticate does end up making the worst possible matchup for our Alolan Raichu if it utilizes both Bite and Crunch. It is a huge tank ending with still over 100 HP left. Yeah, Alolan Raticate is quite the monster. I am really leaning towards Alolan Raticate being on my team at this point. So that is actually it for our Alolan Raichu today. Thank you guys so much for hanging out. I really do appreciate everybody who comes by and comments on the video and says hey and what's up, and you look nice today and you look fairly clean because you trimmed your beard. Always remember that if you guys are looking for specific deep dives for me to go over, please comment them in the description. As soon as they're commented, I do pull them over into a spreadsheet and kind of just tally them up. And that way, once we get enough of them and they're the next pick of most popular pick to go into, we do start to go into those and we get them done just like this video was today. As of this video going live, it is a tie between both Claydol and Gardevoir. So I will end up just choosing one of those 2 to actually be the next deep dive. But any deep dive that you're looking forward to from this point on, go ahead and comment down below. It'll be added into the spreadsheet and we can get to it as soon as possible to help you guys pick the Pokemon for your Nightmare Cup team, which May is pretty much underway and whew, it's gonna be fun. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for hanging out. Remember that if you like to like videos, you can do that. But if you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in the comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you then.